Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Mr. Israelson, for your kind...
Mr.
Bayo, for your introduction. My name is Patricia Kim, and it's a real pleasure and honor to be here tonight in Salt Lake City. I'd like to thank the Utah Council for Citizen Diplomacy, Ambassador John Price and Mrs. Price, UCCED Executive Director Felicia Maxwell-Barrett, and Ms. Perry Kemick and Westminster College for inviting me to give this lecture on U.S. China strategic competition, a topic that is increasingly at the forefront of the minds of many policymakers and foreign policy watchers, and is a challenge that we'll have to grapple with in the coming decades. But before I turn to my lecture, I'd like to start by briefly introducing the U.S. Institute of Peace, where I work as part of the China program team. So USIP is a national, nonpartisan, independent institute founded by Congress in 1984 that is dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical, and essential for U.S. global security. Our creation was the result of 2 decades of work inside and outside of Congress to establish a national institution focused on peace. So starting in the 1950s, this effort was led by veterans from both political parties who had served in World War II and had been deeply affected by their experiences. They advocated for the creation of an institute that is akin to our 4 military service academies that would focus on the study and practice of peace. And then in the 1970s, the efforts accelerated as these activists as well as leaders in Congress were spurred on by a grassroots movement across the United States, where tens of thousands of US citizens mobilized as part of a campaign for a national peace academy, adding momentum to this idea. So then in 1979, President Jimmy Carter appointed a commission to study the possibilities. And then in 1984, the report that was created by Congress was signed into law by President Reagan, which created the U.S. Institute of Peace. Now, grounded in this important history, USIP is an institution that embodies America's commitment to peace, and we are now in our 35th year in 2020, and this core mission in today's world feels much more important than ever. So, as you saw in the video snapshot that we showed, USIP basically operates as a think and do tank. And the video, again, gives you a flavor of the type of work that we do, as well as the priorities that we have for 2020. Our staff work in conflict zones at both the community level as well as with national and regional governments, and we focus very much on connecting top-down as well as bottom-up initiatives together. We also conduct research, we convene policymakers and civil society actors, we conduct training and education, and we generate policy recommendations. Now, USIP's China program, where I sit, we tend to do a little bit more of the traditional think tank work. So we conduct a lot of research to try to understand China's role in various regions around the world. We convene Track 1.5 dialogues, which are basically dialogues that have a mix of government officials as well as experts that are not held at the official level, so that you can have a bit of a more relaxed and honest conversation. We also work closely with our U.S. government counterparts at the State Department, at the Department of Defense, as well as USAID on various projects. In other parts of the Asia Center, as you saw in this video, we have colleagues who are working in actual conflict zones at the grassroots level. And the Asia Center has offices in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Myanmar. And many of these teams, again, are working with civil society leaders, local governments, and youth groups to advance peace on the ground. Before I start, I want to talk a little bit about ways you can engage. So USIP's mission is directed at preventing and resolving violent conflict overseas. But another important part of our mandate calls on us to serve the American public directly by providing education and information on how conflicts can be resolved without violence and how peace is possible. So we have a dedicated public education team that carries this work forward. They actually sent me here tonight. And so we engage across all 50 states, including here in Utah with educators and students. And we do this to raise awareness of USIP's works, to provide resources and ways to engage. For those of you who are interested in following USIP's work, we had flyers in the back table where it outlines the various ways you can get involved. So I encourage you, if you're interested, to sign up for our email newsletter, follow us on social media, and tune in for webcasts for our live public events. Also, we have a lot of resources if you are an educator at all levels, from K through college. And we have all kinds of materials available on usip.org. For students out there, as well as lifelong learners, we have something called a global campus, where we offer free courses online on conflict resolution and peace building. And again, all of this is available on our website. And finally, if any of you plan to visit Washington, D.C. at any point, we'd love to have you come over and visit our iconic headquarters. We are located on the National Mall right across from the State Department. So we welcome public visitor groups by appointment on our website. And if you're traveling as an individual, also feel free to reach out and we can see how we can have you come by. So again, there are flyers in the back if you're interested in engaging. And if you have any specific questions or want to be connected to our public education team, I would be happy to do so. So please come chat with me after the lecture. All right, so now we're going to shift gears and turn to the topic of tonight's lecture, strategic competition between the United States and China. Before I begin, I'd like to note that all of my remarks tonight are mine only. They do not represent the official views of USIP, and they're based on my own research and analysis. So ever since the United States national security strategy and national defense strategy stated that great power competition is back, and a revisionist China is one of the greatest threats that the United States faces, there's been a growing focus on the topic of strategic competition with China in Washington and around the world. And there are grave concerns about whether we're walking into a new Cold War. In the midst of such stark assessments, I believe it's critical that we either exaggerate or underestimate the challenges that are posed by China, and that we try to develop a nuanced picture of what exactly Beijing is trying to do around the world to understand what this strategic competition actually entails. At the same time, I think it's very important to look for ways to continue constructive cooperation with China, because cooperation with China will be necessary to solve some of the greatest international challenges that we have in the coming decades, whether it's denuclearizing North Korea, tackling climate change, or reducing poverty around the world. Now, I would start by noting that the United States' greatest challenge in its competition with China is not in the military realm, but really over the hearts and minds of allies and our regional partners, especially as you move further afield from China's borders. China today is no longer a revolutionary communist state that is funding uprisings around the world like it did in the first half of the Cold War. Rather, it's out to win influence, political leverage, and soft power through its economic success story and offerings. China generally sees cultivating economic prowess as its means to rise to the top. And although its military capabilities have significantly improved over the last 2 decades, Beijing is less interested, at least thus far, in quickly surpassing the United States to become the world's premier military power, or taking on the role of global security power provider that the United States has played since the end of the Second World War. Instead, China seeks to position itself as an economic partner of choice, and it sees this as its primary way to win friends and influence, not only in its immediate neighborhood, but also as far abroad as in Africa and Latin America. Now, to achieve these objectives, Beijing has employed a variety of means, including a public diplomacy campaign that emphasizes that as China prospers, the world will also prosper. So you may have heard some of these ideas or slogans that are connected to this line of argument, such as win-win diplomacy or creating a community of common destiny. So these are some of the favorite phrases that President Xi Jinping likes to use, as well as other Chinese leaders. Now, these terms reflect China's efforts to be seen as a productive player and are essentially China's answer to the call to be a responsible stakeholder and to use its power in positive ways. Chinese leaders have also pitched the idea that China is a different kind of great power and that it seeks to practice a new type of international relations in which large and small states treat each other with respect. Now, not many outside Beijing, especially in its immediate neighborhood, find this narrative very convincing. And there's skepticism for good reason, since Beijing hasn't shied away from using its economic leverage or flexing its military might at times to force states to take its preferences into account. But the point that Beijing is trying to make is that such a new type of international order would basically eliminate the need for alliances and blocs, which Chinese leaders insist are vestiges of the Cold War, and which are basically a direct critique of the United States and its robust network of alliances around the world. Chinese leaders like to stress that because the world is populated with states that have all different political systems and religions and cultures, everyone should basically practice what they call the principle of non-interference and focus on economic development instead, which basically boils down to the proposition, let's get rich together while setting aside politics. Now, this concept draws from China's own recent history, in which it has reaped enormous benefits by setting aside politics and focusing on economics. And this is precisely the type of neighborhood that the Chinese Communist Party finds safe, one in which no one has the right to question the legitimacy of its rule. Now, having said that, you may have seen a lot of headlines in recent months about China and it's out to export authoritarianism and so on. From my personal assessment, I don't think China is necessarily exporting its authoritarian model despite the dramatic headlines and reports we see in the papers. Rather, its willingness to pursue economic projects, often without robust standards for transparency or accountability, as well as its willingness to sell technology to anyone who will buy it, regardless of whether the client is an authoritarian state who might use this technology for repressive purposes, and its public diplomacy efforts that basically highlights the successes of the Chinese and economic and political model, can reinforce non-democratic norms and practices around the world, especially in places where states are already leaning in that direction. So I think there's an important distinction there. China is not necessarily exporting or forcing its model onto others, but it is basically enabling authoritarianism through what could be called a valueless approach to foreign policy, while at the same time shaping global norms by serving as an example of an economically successful yet politically closed state. However, I don't think that China is out to forcefully remake the world in its own image, which is an important distinction to make. Now, Beijing has coupled its public diplomacy campaign with an economic strategy that seeks to draw states into Chinese-led initiatives like the massive Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, that I'm sure everyone here has heard of, which is basically about increasing opportunities for Chinese companies in far-flung locations, as well as operationalizing China's pledge to bring prosperity to its economic powers. Now, China, unlike the United States, has not pitched itself as a regional security provider, but as an indispensable economic partner in regions both near and far from its borders. And many states, especially in the developing world, actually find this Chinese vision very attractive or necessary for their economic bottom lines. In fact, the Chinese message that poverty alleviation and development, as opposed to political reform, must come first in order to have peace and stability, resonates deeply in places like Africa, where many states desperately seek development opportunities. Now, finally, China's diplomatic and economic strategies are coupled with a security strategy that includes efforts to increase the regional and global power projection capabilities of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. Now, there's been great interest in China's growing military capabilities over the last decade, and even more so in recent years with a renewed focus in Washington on the theme of great power competition. Beijing has not been shy about broadcasting its desire to become a world-class military power. Actually, since assuming power in 2012, President Xi has clearly articulated a vision to transform China into a full-fledged, world-class military power by 2050. And a component of this so-called Great Rejuvenation Project includes strengthening and expanding China's military capabilities. So the PLA has been tasked with all kinds of reforms and modernization goals to hit by 2035, and then to hit again by 2050. And just a few months ago, the PRC celebrated its 70th anniversary of its founding, and this included a very flashy military parade that showcased a slew of sophisticated missiles and drones and advanced military aircraft. In addition, China has also vowed to become a strong maritime country, and it's increased its activities in the East and South China Seas. So since 2013, China declared an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea, where its claims to territory overlaps with Japanese and South Korean claims. And it has basically increased its naval and air presence in this area since then. In the South China Sea, as you probably have seen in the news, China has also been building man-made islands in areas that that other countries also claim, like Vietnam and the Philippines and so on. So these activities, as well as the character of its military expansion, generally indicate, however, that Beijing is primarily concerned about its military capabilities closer to home and protecting what it considers its core interests, such as preventing Taiwan from declaring independence, or protecting what it considers its sovereign territory in the East and South China Seas. But I think we'll have to watch as China's interests expand beyond its immediate neighborhood with its growing presence around the world, how exactly it will grow its military footprint to protect these interests. But I think it's important to note that, that China is not necessarily rushing to become a true military peer rival to the United States all around the world just yet. For instance, there's been a lot of attention on Djibouti, where China built its first overseas military base in 2017, and there's been speculation that this base will be, only the first of many that are to come, and that is probably true. But I think it's important to note, so I actually took a trip out to Djibouti in November, and what I'm hearing from folks on the ground, including our American officials on the ground, is that China is not necessarily in Djibouti with the aim of militarily dominating the African or Middle Eastern theaters, but it's really there to pursue much narrower interests of protecting its citizens who are working in this region, protecting its economic projects, maintaining or ensuring that there's maritime stability given the dependence on oil it has from this region, as well as to provide logistical support for its peacekeepers who are deployed around Africa. So these are, this is much more narrow of a focus, and Chinese leaders are not necessarily interested in having a dominant military presence in every theater around the world or waging wars in far-flung locations. Again, they see economic engagement and economic dominance as their primary tool for influence and power. Now, if you had to pick the region where the risk of actual military confrontation between China and the United States is highest, I would say it is East Asia. This is China's immediate neighborhood, where there are many long-standing flashpoints from Taiwan to the East and South China Seas to the Korean Peninsula. And I'm going to zoom in a bit on China's strategy in Northeast Asia, which is an area where I spend much of my time analyzing, and a great example of a place where both cooperation and competition with China are absolutely critical in order to promote regional stability. But this is also a theater where striking the right balance between cooperation and competition is incredibly difficult for the reasons I'll lay out. So to start out first with China's objectives in Northeast Asia. Basically, China seeks a Northeast Asian order in which it enjoys superiority across all dimensions and where it can freely protect its interests while retaining the support and respect of its neighbors. The three pillars of China's grand strategy that I just laid out earlier take on a slightly different shape in this region. First, China's call for a world free of alliances actually faces quite a high barrier in this particular region because the United States, two of the United States' most important allies, South Korea and Japan, are located in Northeast Asia. China also faces barriers in this region because most Northeast Asians, from the Japanese to the South Koreans, even the North Koreans, are actually very skeptical of Beijing's claims that it wants to be a different and better type of great power. In fact, if you look at polling data on global perceptions of China, Japan and South Korea often rank on sort of the most negative ends of the scale. And if you were to conduct surveys in North Korea, I think you would find pretty much similar outcomes, thanks to centuries of rivalry and mistrust in the region. In addition, China's economic strategy that seeks to draw states into Chinese-led initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative also faces challenges in this part of the world, given that rather than being on the receiving end of Chinese development and infrastructure projects, Japan and South Korea are in many ways competitors in this space. So while Beijing has sought to bring South Korea and Japan into BRI and to receive their endorsement and to pursue joint projects, Seoul and Tokyo have basically been hedging with one eye towards Washington, being mindful of their ally. But at the same time, there's also a strong recognition in both capitals that shunning economic ties with China is an unrealistic option, given China's enormous economic role in their region and beyond. North Korea, on the other hand, is theoretically a natural recipient state for BRI projects, given its proximity to China, its low levels of development, and Beijing's strong interest in keeping this state afloat. However, Pyongyang has not been able to plug directly into BRI, given all of the existing international sanctions placed on the country. But this is not to say that there's a lot of interest in China, as well as in South Korea and North Korea, to jumpstart these sorts of projects and create economic corridors along the Korean Peninsula to China and all the way to Europe one day. But these types of projects are basically on hold at the moment with no progress in nuclear negotiations with North Korea. Now finally, while China, as I discussed, is not yet seeking military dominance all around the world, it certainly wants dominance in this immediate neighborhood. And in Northeast Asia is one place where Beijing truly seeks supremacy, and it has demonstrated a willingness in the past to intervene militarily, even when it came at a great cost. So to take the Korean Peninsula as an example, this is an arena where China intervened militarily in the past, as we saw 69 years ago, or 70 years ago now, when the PRC entered the Korean War in October 1950. Now, this was not a decision that was made lightly, and it actually came at a horrible time for the Chinese Communist Party, given that the war broke out not even 1 year into establishing their rule. But it's notable to see that they were willing to intervene nonetheless, to push back on what they saw as the United States getting too close to their border for comfort. Now, on the Korean Peninsula, China's primary objectives today include maintaining stability. It wants to prevent war. It is not seeking war, so I do want to be clear on that. And gradually rolling back the United States' presence while integrating North and South Korea into China's economic orbit. And I think one of the most interesting relationships in this region is actually the China-North Korea relationship. So China basically sees North Korea as a necessary ally despite their historically rocky relationship and all of the headaches that North Korea has caused for the PRC since the beginning of their relationship. Again, pulling China into war just when it had established its republic and bringing instability to its borders with provocative behavior over the last 2 decades. However, Chinese leaders have sought to keep Pyongyang closely aligned. They've basically shielded North Korea from international pressure, and they've served as its primary patron for economic development and integration into the region. Although from time to time, Beijing has also played a critical role in prodding North Korea to come to the negotiating table. So for instance, in 2003, we saw China stop its delivery of oil to North Korea in order to force it to join the 6-party talks. which tried to deal with the North Korean nuclear program, but ultimately failed. And again in 2017, China basically signed on to increasingly tougher sanctions on North Korea at the UN Security Council, which had a large impact on North Korea's calculus as it was ramping up its nuclear and missile tests in late 2017. And these actions undoubtedly impacted Kim Jong-un's calculus to declare at the beginning of 2018 that he was ready to negotiate, that he would be willing to declare his nuclear weapons program finished and basically focus on economic development. Now, since Kim Jong-un's diplomatic outreach to the world, President Xi Jinping has met with the North Korean leader a total of 5 times. And these meetings were all timed to come right before and after Kim's summits with the South Korean president as well as with President Trump. And they were basically intended to demonstrate that China expects to play a role in any negotiations, that it still wields great influence over North Korea, that it will not be sidelined, especially in any discussions about the future order of the Korean Peninsula. In recent months, however, China has not really been playing an active role in this space, and it hasn't really tried to breathe momentum in the impasse that's settled in between the United States and North Korea. And this is because Beijing has basically been consumed by the trade war with the United States, with protests in Hong Kong, and now with this coronavirus. So basically, Beijing has taken a back seat in the nuclear negotiations, signaling its interest and its intentions to be included, but not really taking a leadership role. Today, I think Beijing is pretty comfortable with the fact that the United States and North Korea are still officially engaged in negotiations. Neither side have declared that, that they won't talk to each other anymore, although its level of comfort is probably decreasing as the impasse between the two countries continues. And having negotiations break down is clearly not in China's interest, since it could bring instability right to China's doorstep. Unfortunately, this calm may not last long, however. Since the disappointment at the Hanoi summit in February last year, North Korea has again been ramping up its missile tests, and it's been telling its citizens that it's going to be exploring new strategic weapons, that they should hunker down for a long period of struggle and economic hardship. Now, while we don't know whether North Korea will conduct a nuclear or ICBM test anytime soon, there's a high probability that we may revert back to a cycle of provocation, or that Pyongyang will revert back to a cycle of provocation in order to increase its leverage and until it senses another favorable time to come to the negotiating table. And we can very well imagine in this case a return to the threats of fire and fury between Pyongyang and Washington that we saw in late 2017. But even if we don't have such a dramatic deterioration in the situation and negotiations were to indefinitely stall, the United States and its allies, South Korea and Japan, will likely face 2 competing demands in such a case. They are going to face the imperative to boost Allied defense capabilities to counter the ever-expanding North Korean nuclear and conventional threat. And Beijing, in turn, will see this as undermining its own security interests. At the same time, the US and its allies will also need to secure Chinese cooperation to bring Pyongyang back to the negotiating table. So there are 2 competing demands here. Now, if North Korea closes the door on negotiations for the short to midterm future, the United States and South Korea will probably scale up joint military exercises that have been modified or put on pause since the Singapore summit. There will probably be also a greater emphasis on boosting individual and joint missile defense capabilities, and there will be other measures to strengthen their individual and joint capabilities in response to North Korea's continued threat. In addition, with growing concerns about the Trump administration's commitment to the U.S.-South Korea alliance, there will also most likely be a push by segments of the South Korean policymaking community for more visible signs of the United States commitment. So we will likely see calls for the redeployment of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons to this region, or the creation of some kind of nuclear sharing pact akin to the NATO nuclear weapons sharing pact. in addition to calls within South Korea and Japan for their own indigenous nuclear capabilities, which are becoming more and more mainstream, which is quite scary. Again, Beijing in turn will view such developments unfavorably, given its ultimate objective of reducing, not increasing, the United States' presence in its backyard and rolling back the US-led alliance system in the region. It is likely to push back when it feels that measures adopted by the United States and its allies diminish its own military capabilities and unfavorably shift the regional balance of power, just as it did in the past. And this will not only generate pressure on US allies, like South Korea, but it will also generate pressures within our alliances, and this is not good for us. And also, rather than focusing on bringing North Korea back to the negotiating table, Beijing may actually choose to focus on, again, pressuring allies and to reduce their cooperation with the United States. So to mitigate against these sorts of challenges, it'll be imperative to clearly set expectations with Beijing in advance that the United States and its partners want China's cooperation on North Korea. They would rather not have to take such measures, but they will have no choice but to strengthen their defensive capabilities as long as the North Korean nuclear and missile threat remains unchecked. And I think demonstrating inter-alliance resolve on these issues will be key to convincing Beijing that working with Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo to rein in North Korea will be a faster and more effective route to safeguarding its own security interests. Now, I want to move on to some of the major challenges that China faces in its quest to become a great power. Despite the significant internal and external efforts it's made to expand both its military capabilities as well as its economic presence around the world. First, China faces major internal challenges, from the need to engage in structural economic reform, to struggles to exert control over territories like Hong Kong, Tibet, and Xinjiang, and to build the capacity to deal with unexpected challenges like this recent coronavirus outbreak that has become a huge test for the Chinese Communist Party. But even before the viral outbreak, Beijing has been facing disgruntlement among its citizens over issues such as economic inequality, bureaucratic mismanagement, and even air pollution at the grassroots level, all of which could potentially lead to instability in China's domestic political arena. Now, while Beijing clearly understands that these challenges exist and it has tried to deal with them in various ways, many of these issues cannot be resolved overnight and can certainly distract or slow down Beijing's efforts to transform into a true great power. In addition to these internal challenges, China also faces severe limitations in terms of hard and soft power abroad, especially compared to the United States. So other than a treaty of mutual aid and cooperation with North Korea and some strategic partnership labels here and there, China has no formal alliances, and it just has one overseas military base, again in Djibouti. In contrast, the United States has dozens of allies, dozens of collective defense arrangements, and security partnerships and bases throughout the world. Now, these alliances are an invaluable asset that enable the United States to generally to impact outcomes in the global arena. And because it's a primary security partner for numerous countries in East Asia and beyond, the United States receives lots of strategic benefits, including its allies' willingness to consult, coordinate, and adjust their policies to accommodate US interests, or at the very least, keep the United States informed on any decisions of consequence. Our allies also provide access to foreign bases that allow the United States to be present far and wide. They also contribute troops and political support for various US endeavors. While China has used its economic offerings as its primary way to win the same kind of influence with others, and while many countries, as I said, welcome Chinese economic investment and trade, there are also pervasive fears of Chinese overreach and exploitation, which has sparked grassroots protests and the abrogation of certain BRI projects around the world. For instance, several infrastructure projects in Myanmar, Nepal, and Pakistan have all been suspended or canceled in recent years in light of public pressure and complaints of Chinese colonization. These cases demonstrate that even states with relatively close ties to Beijing and a genuine desire for economic aid will not necessarily accept Chinese investment in the face of domestic resistance and sovereignty concerns. Finally, China also really lags behind in the soft power realm. So again, if you see polls around the world, states by and large tend to say that they believe that having the United States as opposed to China as the world's leading power is better for their interests. And again, this is most pronounced in East Asia, closest to China's borders. And I think this is due to the fact that many East Asians have struggled with Chinese domination in past centuries. They don't want to live under Beijing's shadow, and in large part also because the United States democratic political system, our respect for individual freedoms and the rule of law resonate deeply in countries like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and even inside China, where many elites and citizens alike are disturbed by the increasingly authoritarian turn of their government. Even further afield from China's borders in places like Africa, where many leaders and citizens tend to have much more positive views of China, they still emphasize that they appreciate the United States system. Many leaders, and experts on the ground, when you talk with them, they say, if I could choose, I would rather choose to study in the United States as opposed to China. And many of these publics still gravitate towards American cultural offerings as well. So given this context, I think the United States should have confidence in its ability to manage competition with China. But it's also important to remember that while the United States leadership is welcomed and favored around the world, these positive views should not be taken for granted, and that it takes hard work to maintain and strengthen our greatest assets, whether it's our democratic system or our alliances and partnerships around the world. Now let me conclude by advancing a three-part recommendation on how the United States should manage strategic competition with China going forward, which involves 1, equipping allies and partners to manage China's growing presence around the world. 2, strengthening our alliances and coordinating with our allies to deter China from engaging in destabilizing behavior and encourage it to engage in positive behavior instead. And 3, finding ways to cooperate with China in areas of mutual concern. Now going to the first recommendation. In recent years, Washington has been very strident in warning countries around the world, especially developing ones, that they should be wary of China's BRI because these projects lack transparency, they're not always the highest quality, and they may come with political strings attached. Now what you hear over and over from developing states, however, is that they don't really have the luxury to reject incoming investment, and they are eager to seize these opportunities even if they're not perfect. So rather than simply lecturing states, I think it's important that the United States recognizes that Chinese economic investment and economic activity is here to stay. It can make a great contribution if it's done right, and that it's actually better, rather than asking people to reject Chinese investment, to help build capacity in these states so that state leaders and citizens can have the ability to scrutinize these projects and demand for greater standards, greater quality, and greater transparency. And so this is somewhere where I think we should really be focused. And there has been movement to do more of this. For instance, you may have heard of the BUILD Act, which created the Development Finance Corporation in the United States that will basically encourage U.S. companies to go abroad and to do more work in the developing world. So hopefully this will increase the choices that states have, and by increasing the choices and increasing the competition, raise standards altogether. There's also been lots of funding given to USAID and the State Department to do capacity building, to train next generation leaders, to send lawyers to help scrutinize various contracts that are coming in from China, and I think these are all great things. On the second recommendation on maintaining and strengthening our alliances, I think it's important that Washington doesn't ask our allies to choose between the United States and China. What is very clear if you talk to people throughout Asia and around the world, no one wants to be enlisted in a new Cold War against China. And most of these most of these countries, including the United States, actually count on China as one of their largest, if not most important trade partners. And so it's vital that the US government demonstrates to our allies and partners that we're not, trying to enlist them or use them as chips in a competition with China, but that we value our relationships for their own sake. Now, unfortunately, the United States alliances, especially in East Asia, are undergoing extreme challenges right now. For instance, South Korea and the US are locked in contentious negotiations over cost sharing in the US-ROK alliance. And the US-Japan alliance will also be facing challenging negotiations in a few months. But besides these immediate disagreements, many US allies and partners also have various concerns that range on one extreme from fears that the United States will not honor its alliance commitments and withdraw from its region. And there are actions that have been going on in recent years to encourage these fears, to anxiety on the other extreme that they'll be dragged into a war between the United States and China because of an overzealous approach to great power competition. So in the midst of these kinds of concerns, I think candid dialogue, reassurance, and close coordination with our allies are critical for maintaining these partnerships that really are one of our country's greatest assets. And finally, I'd say that while it's vital to signal to Beijing that the United States and its allies will not tolerate destabilizing behavior, it's also just as vital to reassure Chinese leaders and the Chinese people that the United States does not seek to keep China down, because a disgruntled and isolated China would be just as destabilizing, if not more, than one that it is confidently engaged in the global arena. So I think as the competitive aspect of the US-China relationship grows, it'll become even more important to double down and invest in the cooperative aspect of the relationship as well. US-China engagement will be vital for preventing escalation in the bilateral relationship, finding diplomatic solutions to the many outstanding conflicts that we have, as well as seizing opportunities to work together on pressing issues like climate change and denuclearizing North Korea, which cannot be solved without China's active participation. So let me leave it there, and I will look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.